Hello, fellow word nerds and language lovers, and welcome to Lexiconned, the podcast where we dive into the curious origin of words and phrases, separate fact from folklore, and occasionally chortle over words like the subject of this episode, shit. Now I know what you're thinking. Are they really kicking off this podcast with shit? And the answer is yes. Yes, we are. Because if we're going to talk about language, why not start with one of the most versatile, misunderstood, and downright satisfying words in the English language? To address the elephant in the room, or poop on the deck as one popular myth might have it, you may have heard that SHIT is an acronym for Ship High in Transit or Store High in Transit. Now supposedly, this phrase was stamped on crates of manure in the olden days to indicate that it needed to be stored high on a ship to avoid moisture and the resulting explosive methane buildup. Well, I hate to burst your bubble, or methane, as it were, but that's completely false. As delightful as it is to imagine sailors yelling, "Ship it high, lads!" That's not how language, or even acronyms, worked back then. In fact, acronyms like this didn't really come into fashion until the 20th century. So, where does shit come from? Well, other than the physical representation, where does the word come from? For that, we need to step back in time. Shit traces its roots to the Old English word, sitte, meaning diarrhea. And yes, the Old English had a word for diarrhea. Priorities when you live in an era with a lack of clean water and limited medical professionals. It's related to the Middle Low German, scheit, and the Dutch word scheiten, both of which mean to defecate. Now, the earliest use of shit in the English language is in the Old English period of pre-1150, where it was primarily a noun. The word was strictly literal for centuries, appearing in medical texts and the occasional insult. One of the earliest recorded uses is from a mid-10th century manuscript of medical text titled Bald's Leech Book, which translated says, quote, "In case a person's food digests badly and turns to an evil liquid and shit, 'tis good for these people that they should spew. If it is difficult for them, induce with wort drink so that they spew." End quote. Right, so the medical theory of the day suggests that when a person has diarrhea, the best remedy is to induce vomiting. Solid practice. Nearly 200 years later, there's evidence that shit was used as a verb. In around 1335, a satirical poem, which parodied the Norse practice of toasting the saints, whose name roughly translates to "Hail St. Michael with the long spear," has a line in it that says, "When in that place, you must shit in there." And no, I don't think he was referring to the bathroom. By the 16th century, shit started to branch out and became a catch-all for worthless stuff, which kind of makes sense. Moving forward in time, by the 18th century, it is believed that shit was used fairly commonly in conversation. Then in the 19th century, we see an early appearance of profanity in the West Somerset Word Book, which portrays shit as a noun reserved exclusively for men, defined as, quote, "a term of contempt applied to men only," as in, he's a regular shit. As social perceptions evolved, the word became increasingly more taboo and inappropriate, which led to considerable censorship. In America, the Comstock Act of 1873 would not only serve as the groundwork to censor future media, but also ban many works that were perceived to be obscene, including notable classics like Ulysses by James Joyce, Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, and from the Middle Ages, the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, which contains some of the oldest known uses of the word shit. Even Nobel Prize receiving author Ernest Hemingway drew criticism for the word appearing in his short story, Two Tales of Darkness, which was published by the Atlantic magazine in 1957. It wasn't until October 14, 1999, when the word shit was first aired uncensored on a U.S. network television show in an episode of Chicago Hope. In that same year, the word shit was also said uncensored 200 times in a single episode of South Park. Now, if you're wondering how South Park could get away with using this beloved expletive 200 times and Chicago Hope only once, well, our dear friends at the Federal Communications Commission, better known as the FCC, have the authority to regulate indecent or profane content applying primarily to broadcast television and radio. So thankfully, those cable channels, your streaming services, and even this podcast are safe from their moralistic oversight. And for those of you who may be curious about censorship and penalties enacted by the FCC, please recognize that it can impose a maximum fine of $325,000 for a single violation of indecency and profanity guidelines for television and radio broadcasts between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. For multiple stations, the fine can be up to $3 million. So what's the biggest fine received for using the word shit? Well, we don't know. because while many broadcasters and presenters have faced fines by the FCC for their use of profanity, the exact amounts and specific words involved are not always detailed in public records. But we do know that between 1990 and 2004, the FCC issued fines totaling more than $2.5 million to radio licensees for airing material it deemed indecent from The Howard Stern Show, which is the highest amount of any American radio show. Despite these censors' best efforts, by the end of the 20th century, the word shit had firmly planted roots in the garden of vulgarity and was flourishing as slang, taking on meanings as diverse as nonsense, trouble, and sometimes something great. But we're not done yet. If shit were a Hollywood actor, it would win the award for most versatile performance. Seriously, shit is like the Gary Oldman of profanity. We all know that shit is a noun, a verb, and an adjective, but let's take a moment to appreciate just how many roles this word plays and how long we've enjoyed their use. Shit-faced, meaning drunk, was introduced in the 1960s as student slang. Shit-list, meaning the people with whom one is displeased or angry, is as early as 1942. Shithole, as in rectum, was referenced in 1937, and the modern applied reference to an undesirable location can be traced to 1969. Shitload, or a measure of a great many, roughly 1970. The slang to not give a shit or not care is prevalent by 1922. To get one's shit together, meaning to manage one's affairs, became parlance by roughly 1969, and the reference shitticism is from American poet Robert Frost's word for scatological writing. I'm sure you remember, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I shit on the one less traveled. Up shit creek, meaning in trouble, goes back to 1868 from a South Carolina context, presumably an adaptation of the metaphoric Salt River. And let's not forget its iconic role in phrases like, the shit hits the fan, which dates back to mid-20th century as well and paints a vivid, if unpleasant, picture of chaos. Or, how about, scared the shit out of me, which captures fear so perfectly that no other word would do. It's no wonder comedians, writers, and everyday people love shit. It's a linguistic Swiss Army knife. Crude, yes, but endlessly adaptable. So what's the real scoop on this word? Well, as we've explained, shit is a good old-fashioned Germanic word with no acronyms, no crates of manure, and no ships involved in its creation. Its evolution mirrors the way language develops naturally, starting with a literal meaning, expanding into metaphors, and eventually becoming one of the most colorful, flexible words in our lexicon. And while shit has been embraced, vilified, censored, and occasionally abused, ultimately its use and presence in modern language has persevered and flourished. So there you have it. Shit, a word with ancient roots, mythical stories, and a modern reputation for being, well, everywhere. We hope you enjoyed today's deep dive into the linguistic muck. And remember, words are like shit. They're messy, but they fertilize your creativity. Join us next time on Lexiconned, where we'll dig into another word or phrase, debunk some myths, and laugh our way through language. Until then, don't take any of this shit too seriously. See you next time. Lexiconned is written, recorded, and produced by me, your logophile companion, TJ Martin. Sources and additional credits are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.